Inescapably. Inescapably.
Inescapably foreign. Welcome to Without Borders. I'm your host, Nolan Yuma. Today I'm here with Professor Benjamin Cheung. In fact, he was my professor of cultural psychology at UBC. So if you've tuned into the show before, you know that means his lectures have influenced, well, pretty much everything I do here. And I also had the honor of talking to Ben's colleague, Dr. Stephen Hine, where we talk about self-esteem, culture and morality. So please make sure to check out that episode as well. That's episode 18. We might bring up some of those topics again today, but I'm especially interested in learning about Ben's expertise, which is genetic essentialism, culture and sleep, and the most talked about topic on my show, acculturation. But first off, Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to do this. Thanks. How are you doing?
Well, I'm excited to have you here. It's been a long time. You probably don't know how much of an influence you had on me, actually, but it's I go through your lecture notes probably once a week for preparing for these interviews, and
that's great.
Yeah. So now, before we get into all of your research, I want to get a little bit into your story, because you refer to yourself as a 1.5 generation Chinese Canadian.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so when we talk about, first generation, second generation, first generation is referring to someone who is, born in the place that they were growing up in. So when we talk about a first generation immigrant, not born in the place, they moved to the place that they're growing up in now. So a first generation is usually someone who has, let's say, moved from, in my parents' case, for example, from Hong Kong to Vancouver. Second generation is someone who is born there. And then it's more of a sociological term, using the term 1.5 generation. 1.5 generation is that generation that's sort of in between, where first generation, we're now thinking of more in terms of like adults, people who moved in adulthood, who've already more or less created their cultural identity prior to moving. And then you have the second generation that grow up in that new place and sort of expecting to develop more of a mainstream kind of cultural identity. The 1.5 is sort of that group where we're in between, we move as kids, and so we have quite a bit of the heritage cultural identity, but we also mix in a lot of that new mainstream cultural identity as well. It's not to say that second generation doesn't retain any heritage cultural identity. Certainly it does a lot, and a lot of students that I talk to now certainly have that kind of talk a lot about being in that liminal space between heritage culture and mainstream culture. But 1.5 is just to denote that, sure, we are technically first generation immigrants, but we're also qualitatively, we have very different experiences compared to other first generation immigrants who move as adults.
And I remember learning about that all in your class. And I remember when I first learned the term third culture kid, I never heard it before. And then I was like, holy shit, this is me. And then we go through all not symptoms, or just the things the characteristics. And it was just spot on from my experience.
Yeah.
And for me, it helped. I went to UBC when I was a little bit older. I didn't go when I was 18, so I had a little bit more experience.
Sure.
But even then, I was still having some identity issues. And I think even now as an adult, I do to a certain extent. But it definitely isn't as they describe third culture kids in the textbook and what I experienced when I was younger.
Yeah.
And everything we learned in the class, just having that theoretical knowledge kind of helped me to understand myself. And I'm just wondering, for you, like I'm assuming from all the knowledge that you have, it probably made you a little bit less confused over time, or am I wrong in assuming that?
You mean in terms of my cultural identity?
Yeah, like just from all your studies, did it start to make you a little bit more aware of why you're acting this certain way, or maybe why you were confused at certain periods of your life? Like, did it clear anything up for you?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll say is that from my experience growing up in Vancouver, I think because the area that I lived in had such a strong immigrant culture and immigrant influence, and the area that I grew up in had a lot of South Asians and East Asian immigrants and immigrant children.
Which
Going
area?
there? I was in so like South Vancouver, Marpole area in Vancouver. And that area, yeah, that area is very diverse. That's very close to what people colloquially refer to as the Punjab market, around Main Street and Fraser Street, and I was just on the west side of all of that. And it was, I think that was actually really helpful for me because I was able to develop a cultural identity that felt genuine and authentic to both my cultural experiences as an immigrant child, having sort of the everyday influences of the mainstream culture as well. And that's a very different experience, compared to what a lot of my other students who grew up as Asian immigrant children, whether 1.5 generation or second generation or beyond, and then having grown up in a much less diverse kind of area, that creates a lot more confusion for them because then they don't know how to handle the stark contrast between school culture, school environment, and home culture and home environment. So for me, I think the area that I lived in was a big advantage for me in not having to feel that kind of identity confusion growing up. I mean, there was always going to be some, just because mainstream society has and encourages different kinds of cultural values and behaviors and such compared to what people might do in the home. But yeah, that really helped. But if you're asking about whether or not the knowledge that I've gained has helped with that. I think if anything, it helps me have the language to parse through and to articulate the kinds of experiences that I've had, the kinds of observations that I've made. I think it helps, especially people who haven't been able to think about these things before. And I think it helps people who might have had more difficult experiences and more difficult identity confusions and conflicts growing up to navigate that kind of space.
So I know it varies quite a bit, but what are some of the tools that you could bring up right now for this adaptation period, or whether there is a more sensitive period for cultural adaptation, if there are any general strategies for people and cultures that want to adapt? And again, on this show, I always begin it by saying it's for immigrants, refugees, expats, or anyone else that feels inescapably foreign, because sometimes people who haven't lived in a different country, but their parents come from a different country and they have a completely different value system, they come from a different culture, they also have to tackle with this feeling foreign in a way. So what kind of strategies come out right away? Like, what are some of the main ones?
It's really hard to do this. It's really hard to enact any of these things when you're in the adjustment period, because that adjustment period is oftentimes when people are quite a bit younger, like early teens, mid-teens kind of period, is when, well, really any time from birth to like mid-teens is when people are most sensitive to their cultural environment. And so it's kind of hard, for us to say, well, kids should be doing this to maximally adjust. I think kids will just naturally absorb what is in their environment. What becomes a bigger issue is, I think, how parents are handling that process. And I think the parents are oftentimes a primary factor for how successfully the children are able to navigate that difficult kind of both period in their lives as well as a difficult cultural situation for them. And I say that because I think oftentimes, and especially immigrant parents, aren't prepared to have these kinds of conversations with their children about cultural disparities and cultural conflicts and having different cultural identities, because they haven't had to deal with that themselves oftentimes, right? And so how do you have that conversation about something that you yourself haven't had experience with, or you yourself might not understand? And so I think a lot of it doesn't actually fall onto the shoulders of the children who are trying to navigate that cultural space. It actually falls on the parents who are, a lot of children will often say, I didn't ask to come here, which is true. It's the parents who would have done all that preparation work, all that legwork ahead of time to go, okay, we're going to do this to prepare for us moving there. But that's mostly in terms of let's figure out what school the kid is going to go to, or what kind of jobs we're going to get once we get there, or what kind of home we're going to live in once we arrive. But, the children don't have any kind of say in this, right? Whether they are children who are moving as 1.5 generation, or children who are not even born, and then they will be born in that new cultural space. There's not much for them to do, because all they're trying to do is to just grow up. Right? I think ultimately it comes down to the parents, and have the parents be more educated and more aware about how to have these conversations, and to maybe connect with other parents who've gone through a similar process to think about how to best support the children's cultural identity and cultural development, how to have those difficult conversations about, what happens when children say to their parents, I want you to stop making me bring paneer to school because the kids are making fun of me for the smell that it has, or whatever. And that still happens quite a bit. And some of my students even now talk about how they've had to endure that. And so how do parents have those conversations so that they can help their children develop a sort of a healthy kind of cultural identity that is representative of the cultural mixing that's in their environment growing up?
Yeah, I think it must be so difficult for parents, because I think my parents did an excellent job in many ways, but I got bullied a shit ton when I was younger.
Yeah.
I grew up in a small town, so this was before Nutella became a popular thing, so they were shit sandwiches. Anyways, really? I've gone over those stories on the show before, so I won't get into it again. But I think it must be so difficult to find this balance where you want your child to be proud of their cultural heritage, but you also don't want it to clash with the culture that they're in. And it's finding that balance that can be very difficult.
Yeah, for a lot of parents, I think you'll find that their primary objective is to make sure that their kids don't forget their heritage culture. And I think in many cases, they don't want their kids. It's a very weird dynamic where, parents take their kids to this new place, but then also don't want their kids to be like the people who are from that new place. And I find that to be highly unrealistic, and and this is why I place a lot of that responsibility on the parents, that you need to prepare yourself for these expectations, right? That you need to expect that your child is going to develop in a very different way culturally from what you might have been used to growing up in the heritage space.
And have you noticed that from what third culture kids report, that they need to lie more. I was lucky that that was my dad's number one rule. He's like, you can do anything. Like he knows all my party stories. He knows all the bad things I've done. Number one was like, you never lie to me. But when I talk to some other kids or now adults that are in a similar situation as me, they had to grow up lying to their parents because the things that their parents said were wrong were accepted with their friends. And if they told their parents the truth, they could get beat in some cases, or just get scolded, right?
I think this certainly transcends what, whether someone is third culture or immigrant kids. I think in general, when you have parents that tend to be more harsh in their parenting, and tend to be much more sort of authoritarian in how they parent their kids, it compels the child to do what they can to avoid punishment, right? And so then you do get a lot of that deception, you do get a lot of that lying, and you sometimes will see, and I will say that this happens quite a lot with immigrant parents, because a lot of immigrant parents come from, I'm thinking in particular about Asian parents who come from a lot of cultures where there's a lot more sort of, you might see a lot more parental surveillance of children's behaviors, a lot more sort of helicoptering of parents, of their children. And sometimes the use of corporal punishment is also very common in some parenting spaces in amongst Asian immigrant parents too. And so I think that kind of parenting often leads kids to develop this tendency of, okay, I want to do this thing that everyone else is doing, but they're not letting me do it, so I'm going to do it in secret, because they're going to do it anyway. So it's counterproductive. I think that's why in a lot of cases parents end up having a very unrealistic and inaccurate mental perception of what their kids are like and what their kids are actually doing. Totally.
Definitely. So any parents listening to this show right now, keep that in mind. And what about for strategies for adults who are adjusting to a new culture? Because sometimes when I talk to people who move to a new country in their 20s and they spent the majority of their adult life in a new country, they also have a lot of the same struggles as I did, or sometimes a lot of the same benefits, right? They're able to, they're more like chameleons. They're able to adapt in different situations, but they definitely deal with this, I'm becoming, or I'm finding a new side of myself. And then they start to struggle with this identity. So what kind of strategies do adults have?
I think the biggest thing is to understand that identities will change over time, right? And we sometimes will talk in terms of studying identity and the formation of identity. Just because we formed an identity and we've achieved an identity after our adolescence or early adulthood, it doesn't mean that identity doesn't change over time either. I think the healthiest thing for people to do is, even if they've achieved a certain kind of identity, that they're still willing to be open to the idea that they can explore new things and how their identities can continue to change moving into the future. The way that our identities develop oftentimes is a function of our environment, right? What kinds of possibilities do we see for ourselves in terms of in what directions can our identities develop? And when we go to a new place, we can potentially see new ways, right? New avenues in which our identities can develop and change. And so I think a big part of it is not being worried or scared that, I think I'm changing into a different person, as long as you're not doing terrible things as a new identity.
how would you define the authentic self? Because that's where sometimes you get in a little bit of a discussion here. It's like, oh, well, if you're changing and adapting, you're not being authentic. And that's kind of like what Carl Rogers would emphasize, right? The importance of having this stable core self that stays the same from place to place. And then you had Gergen and the postmodern writers who emphasize the importance of having these different identities. Mm-hmm. What to you is an authentic self then?
So I don't believe that there is like one single authentic self that is stable with you for the entirety of your life. I think for some people that's certainly the case, and so it's easy to talk about that as being the authentic self, especially for people who really only grow up in one place and only know that environment, and so has developed an identity that works for them in that environment. So that's easy to say that that's your authentic self. Sometimes that authentic self might people don't generally change drastically. I'm not saying that they necessarily do that, but that people might add on things to their identities, or there might be slight shifts in their identities over time as they get older. Like you'll have people who might have been very very congenial when they're a little younger, or very patient, but over as they get older, they don't want to take shit from people anymore, and they become a little more cantankerous, and it doesn't mean that they're no longer authentic. They are authentic because that's just how they've come to develop over time, because of maybe changes in their circumstance or changes in how they're processing their philosophy in life. So there might be this idea of an authentic self. I don't believe that has to be this perpetually stable constellation of things that never changes. I don't believe that that's the case.
I agree, and I don't even think it's possible in many cases.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And then, what about the ego death? Like this complete loss of subjective self-identity. People talk about that, and I'm wondering what you think about it, because sometimes I relate this feeling of ego death to some of the indigenous writers, and when they talk about the mystical and some of these mystical experiences. I'll get into it a little bit more later as to why I kind of connect these two. But I'm just thinking, first of all, what do you think about this idea of ego death? Is this something that people should strive towards? Do you think it could be beneficial? It could be harmful?
Sorry, I'm less familiar with the idea of ego death. Can you talk a bit more about that?
It relates to this idea of this, like, some complete loss of subjective self-identity. And, well, I mean, that's what I know about it. And to me, I think it's this feeling where you don't feel separate from anything else, possibly, right? You're so in the moment that you're not, you don't have any judgments about others in that moment. You might not have any judgments about yourself. Now that's how I kind of understand it. I might be wrong about this, but that's kind of how I understand it.
Okay. It's sounding a little to me like someone who's on psychedelics. And
that was going to be my connection a little later, actually. I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, it sounds a little like someone on psychedelics, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that the reason why, for example, microdosing psilocybin and other kinds of psychedelics are beneficial for people is because it does allow them to relieve. Because when people are so conscious of everything, it creates the problem that they become, especially in the modern world, they become worried and concerned about everything, and it creates a lot of anxieties that they have about everything. But sort of just losing yourself and losing everything that you are concerned about, and just sort of being connected with everything, and from by all the reports of people who use psychedelics and similar substances, and people who engage in microdosing, it's a hugely beneficial process for them that is very effective at alleviating anxiety, effective at alleviating depression. And so I think to that extent, that kind of experience has a net positive for folks.
Now, for me, psychedelics have had a positive effect on my life, both when it comes to anxiety and depression, and then just having fun as well.
Yeah.
I'll be honest about that.
Yeah.
And I think it made me a better person in many ways. It makes me more empathetic, makes me connect to nature and have a better understanding of our connection to nature, also a deeper understanding of, that's why I brought up the indigenous writings, when they talk about this spirit in nature. And I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I feel sometimes the spirit in the nature, and I understand those texts on such a deeper level. But then I was thinking about like Michael Pollan and how the book, and now the Netflix series, How to Change Your Mind. I'm a huge fan of it, and I agree with a lot of the things that are presented in the book, but it's quite anecdotal. And a lot of the people there are Westerners. And I was wondering about that because I live in Spain right now, and the whole microdosing thing, very West Coast, I think. Like, when I go back to Vancouver, everybody's microdosing. Everyone's got their little mushrooms. Everyone's got their gummies. I come back here, if I bring it up, like, and I try and have a serious conversation, like, oh, this could be beneficial. They just like, they think I'm some hippie. They think like, they don't even want to read the research. And I'm wondering, in those cases, would it be beneficial for them, or would it have more of a negative outcome because they weren't raised in this culture where it's more accepted? I mean, it's only recently that microdosing has become so accepted on the West Coast. But still, I wonder if it's having a more beneficial outcome because people are part of this culture.
I think when there is a culture that's supportive of the use of that kind of substance, that is important for predicting, I think, better outcomes from using that substance, right? So, for example, we're thinking about the high level of criminalization of various other forms of drugs and narcotics, and I'm thinking about in the context of, let's say, North America. There's really we're now developing a much more tolerant, much more accepting culture around marijuana use. And where I'm also thinking about things like cocaine, and thinking about how indigenous people in South America specific people in indigenous people in South America have historically and traditionally been using coca leaves, from which cocaine is derived, for a long time, without the same kinds of social ills and problematic social effects associated with using that kind of substance. So I think a lot of it comes down to, how should I say this? I think there's a net benefit to using these kinds of substances, right? As long as there's a good culture that surrounds the use of that substance, and good culture that supports that kind of substance. When there isn't, and there is huge criminalization of that kind of behavior and huge stigma associated with that kind of behavior, then it becomes a net negative. Because then you have people who are being stigmatized as people who use these substances. You have people who are being pushed into the peripheries of society for using these substances, and especially when you have people who are using it, specifically to try to cope with mental illnesses, to try to cope with mental health problems. And there isn't enough support for people who are dealing with those kinds of issues, especially if they're very severe. And so there's not enough social resources for them, and there's being stigmatized, and they're being criminalized for doing this, the one thing that seems to be helping them deal with their mental illnesses and traumas, then it becomes problematic. So if you're talking about having conversations with people in, let's say, Spain, and you're talking about, well, let's try out some psilocybin or some kind of psychedelic, I think how well it's going to go for them will depend on whether or not there is enough acceptance within society, whether or not they're going to get, because I can imagine someone getting momentary relief from whatever anxieties they might be dealing with, but then they lose their job. And then and so as a net benefit, or as a net calculus of benefits and cost, that I think the cost would win out in that sense.
I'm glad you explained it all so thoroughly, because it's something that I was thinking about, especially after that Michael Pollan video, because now, because of Netflix, that video just gets out there.
Yeah.
Within all these different cultures, and in a way that's a good thing. Like, I hope that helps some of the other cultures become a little bit more open-minded to it. But on the other side, I was a little bit worried about people that might go out and do it, and then they hear about, like, okay, one trip and 8 months of long-lasting positive effects, and it's like, well, that depends on the environment that you're in.
Exactly. And there are places where using drugs can be a long time prison sentence. And whatever momentary euphoria one might derive from using that substance, if you're in that space, that's terrible things are going to happen to you. We're talking about, let's say, a place like Singapore, where there are really, really strict substance laws. You could be hanged, you can be caned, really, really traumatic kinds of physical punishment on individuals for being associated with substances and drugs. I think there's a responsibility on individuals then to think about, if they were to use this, what are the social consequences as well, not just thinking about what kind of benefits they get. And this is not to place the responsibility solely on individuals, because I think culture should be, my ideal, and this is just me speaking as an individual person, I would hope to see more cultures be more open to sort of a more responsible strategy, responsible policies towards substance use, as opposed to just wholesale criminalizing everything. Because criminalizing the use of substances only makes the problem worse. And we've seen that already through the prohibition. We're seeing that now through the overdose crises in Vermont, in British Columbia, in a lot of places. And and so in some ways it's not up to the individual, but it is up to the individual to be aware that these are the consequences.
I completely agree with you. Sometimes I like to play the devil's advocate on the show just to get a conversation going, but here I just can't. It's just ingrained in me here. But all this also relates to genetic essentialism in a way, especially when we're talking about depression. And I think one problem that we have in society is that this idea that depression is genetic, which it can be in some ways, right? But then it kind of leads to this fatalistic view where it's like, oh, it's in my genes, I am a depressed person, and now I need to take, let's just say, the American cocktail of all these prescription drugs, and this is the way that I have to solve it. And then, well, one solution, we were talking about the psychedelics, but I think an even more important one is the social aspect, right? Like, a big part of depression, childhood trauma, or just in your adult life, if you don't have good social bonds. And there's just so much research that points to that. So that is one example, I think, where we can talk about how your genes don't influence necessarily the outcome, right? There is so much that you can do to change how you feel, how you think. I was wondering if you could bring up some other examples from your research with genetic essentialism, and especially when it comes to kind of getting rid of some of these fatalistic views that some people might have.
Yeah, one thing I'll start off by is talking about how there's actually quite a bit of research. I'm thinking there's a faculty member by the name of Jo Phelan, and she's done some really, really cool work on how people perceive folks with mental illnesses, depending on whether the condition is described as having some sort of genetic basis or not. And generally, when people think that some sort of mental illness is associated more with genetic predispositions or genetic foundations, they tend to perceive those kinds of mental illnesses as being more severe, more serious, and they also often will report being less willing to engage with those folks as well, and that's unfortunate because then that exacerbates the problem, right? Because if someone has, let's say, depression, and you think, oh, that person, they have this family history of depression and it must be genetic, let's and it's difficult for them to, and they also expect. They're more pessimistic about the prognosis. They don't expect it to get better that easily, and so then they worry about, then I'm not going to be able to talk to them because how can I'm not going to be able to fix their depression, and so I don't want to associate with them. I don't want to socialize with them. And then from the perspective of the person with the depression, that kind of sucks because then they have the depression plus no one to talk to.
Yeah.
And then that sort of perpetuates the self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, then their depression never gets better. And so that's hugely problematic and unfortunate that happens. But we also know that there are, a lot of things are structural. People are depressed and anxious because of structural things, because of a demanding work culture in their environment that does not allow them to have good socialization experiences. Terrible work-life balance is also a huge predictor of that, and we know now that there's enough research now that I'm pretty confident to say that reducing the number of work days in a week will massively help with this kind of situation with people's mental health. And there's been multiple studies showing similar findings of people reporting significant increases in well-being by moving to a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week. Even having that 1 day extra day off seems to be making a huge difference. And I know that for me, it's been hugely beneficial where I have 1 day where I'm working from home and I'll have a lot more freedom to work or not work during that 1 day in the middle of the week. It's been so beneficial for me, and so beneficial for my mental health too. So there's the structural piece of it, and then there's the I think oftentimes people talk about there not being enough resources, affordable resources for them to access. Mental health care is in many cases exorbitantly expensive. In Vancouver, for example, going to see a counselor can set you back about $130, $150 per 50 minutes session.
Yeah.
And if you want 70 minutes, that gets to closer to about $170, $180. And clinical psychologists are even more expensive. And psychiatrists are few and far between as well, and you need to go through referral processes with your family physician, and so just there's not good enough accessibility of mental health resources for people to be able to talk through things. And that kind of talk therapy, psychotherapy, is a long-term process. And it's one of those things where you need to sink more money into it before you can actually get better, right? Because if, let's say, we even need, let's say, 5 sessions, which is a very conservative estimate, you need 5 sessions, then you're already sinking almost $1,000 into counseling. And not a lot of people have that kind of money. Not a lot of insurance policies cover psychotherapy. And even when they do cover psychotherapy, they will cover, let's say, about $1,000 or maybe $1,200. And that is not really enough for long-term sustainable kind of recovery. And people will often talk about how, oh yeah, I used to go to this therapist, I'm better now, I've stopped. And then at some point they'll go, oh my God, I'm relapsing, I need to go talk to my therapist again, right? Yeah. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's possible for people to lead full and fulfilling lives as long as they have the right support. Whether they have genetic bases or not, that's almost irrelevant here. And people can also do a mix of pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. Whatever works for them, that's totally fine. But what we need is for there to be more compassionate social policies around healthcare support and mental health care support in particular.
I completely agree.
Yeah. So I think that helps. That would help with really anyone who does actually have that kind of, or they think that they have that gene that codes for depression, for which none really exists. There's no such thing as I have the depression gene. But people assume that that's the case for themselves anyway, and become very pessimistic and, as you're saying, fatalistic about the outlook. But I think so much of that becomes a matter of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you don't think that you're able to get better, you're less likely to seek help. And if you're less likely to seek help, then you're not going to get better.
Definitely. And you're talking about in Canada, where it's less taboo than in many other countries. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Now, I'm also wondering what you brought up about the work hours. I'm on the same page. I agree. But how weird is the research here? Because I wonder if it would have a different effect, let's say in China, because I teach a lot of Chinese students. Yep. They work way harder than Western students. They have way longer hours. Yep. And of course, I don't know what they're actually feeling, but just from how they behave in class, they seem so much more positive and happy, to be honest, than many of my Western students. Yep. And they're working way harder and longer. Yep. Yeah. So do you think that the shorter work hours would have the same effect in that culture, or would it?
I think it would. And I say this primarily because you're right. A lot of that research is coming from a lot of weird places, but there's also some research coming out of Japan as well, where there is a very similar kind of overworking culture. And changing that work. I think most recently it might have been Microsoft in Japan that might have experimented with a 4-day work week. I can't remember exactly which company it was. They experimented with a 4-day work week, and they were also finding similar boosts in well-being and boosts in productivity as well, where they're more productive working 4 days than they were productive working 5 days. Yeah. And so I think it's one of those things where it's about working smarter and not working harder. Yeah. And giving people the space to recuperate and to recover. And I think what's important to consider is that the world is very different now than it might have been, let's say, several decades ago, right? I think the demand for things have become a lot more severe, and for more things to get done has become stronger now than it has in the previous decades. And it's hard to keep grinding day in and day out for so many days, and it's actually quite striking to me how much of an impact it has simply for having one extra day for people to be off.
Yeah. Good to know. Oh, and just anyone who's tuning into this show for their first time, weird means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I've brought it up on the show many times, but if it's your first time tuning in, that's how we're using the word weird. Now, this ties into some of your other expertise, sleep, right? Having a little bit more time off means you can sleep a little bit more, recover. Now, just so people have a little bit of a basis here when we're talking about sleep, we've got the 4 stages. And I think in a lot of the mainstream thoughts about sleep, everyone always talks about REM. Like, oh, you need REM sleep. What about the REM sleep? But really, N3 is one of the most important stages of sleep when it comes to muscle recovery, aiding in your memory. So just so everyone's kind of on the same page, can you just quickly go over the stages of sleep?
I'm not the best person to go over the stages of sleep here, actually.
Okay.
Dr. Heine probably is. I think what we're doing, we were primarily talking about, we were primarily looking at cultural differences in what sleep really means to people, and what are the effects of, and the cultural differences, interestingly, are the effects of sleep deprivation, or what we would define as sleep deprivation in different places.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think we often have this assumption that we need 8 hours of continuous sleep as being ideal for us to be to be optimally functional. And Nolan, you would have learned about this in my class as well, where that kind of assumption really didn't come about until several decades ago, because prior to that, and certainly prior to industrialization and prior to having reliable artificial lighting, people used to sleep in 2 phases. Humans oftentimes have this biphasic sleep where people would sleep sometime around dusk and then wake up in the middle of the night and then go to sleep again and then wake up around dawn. And so if we were to look at historical data, we actually see a lot of people waking up in the middle of the night, and then they're engaging in different kinds of activities, and they'll note down in their diary about being in this like phase in between the 2 sleeps, and then they'll go back to sleep afterwards. And that's actually quite common. And if we also look at different subsistence cultures, we also see similar kinds of sleep behaviors as well. And it really didn't seem to be until the advent of artificial lighting that our sleeping patterns started shifting into something that was more of a consolidated chunk at night and staying awake later into the night as well. And then in thinking about cultural differences in what sleep means, what's really interesting is it seems to be the case that different cultural groups have different ideas about how much sleep people are supposed to have. And people from different cultures also have different beliefs about the relation between sleep and health. So, for example, in our research, we found that Japanese participants idealized a lower amount of sleep.
People from Singapore and Japan sleep the least, and then people from New Zealand and the Netherlands sleep the most.
Yeah, and sometimes US is also probably some up there as well. In our study, participants from Japan idealized sort of like a 6.5, 7 hours of sleep, whereas people in Canada were idealizing around 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. So quite a sort of a stark contrast between these different groups. And then we were also finding that people in Japan they tended to expect a much weaker connection between sleep and health. Right? So we asked people, on a scale of -2 to +2, right? -2 would be expecting that there is a strong negative correlation between sleep and health. In other words, more sleep is associated with very poor health. And then +2 is associating a lot of sleep with very positive health. And what we found was that people in North America, people in Canada in particular, were expecting a much more positive connection between sleep and health. Whereas for the Japanese participants, their response was closer to between a 1 and a 0. So 0, we defined it to the participants as no connection between sleep and health. And so they were somewhere between the no connection to a very weak positive connection. Certainly didn't see the same kinds of necessity or the benefits or the importance of sleep for their health compared to people from Canada. And so we're getting this really interesting thing where not only are people idealizing a less amount of sleep, not only are they actually getting less sleep, but they're also expressing a very different set of cultural beliefs about the connection between sleep and health as well.
Now, does it have any positive effects for them? Like, are they able to handle sleep deprivation in a different way? Are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. So,
are there fewer? I wonder about, like, especially car accidents, because that's a big one, right?
Yeah, as a function of sleep deprivation, we see higher level, a spike in car accidents in North America when we do the daylight savings and we spring forward an hour. Yeah. And people lose an hour of sleep often, and then we see more car accidents the next day, literally the next day. We haven't looked at car accident data. We had been looking at more of a coarse sort of measure of physical symptoms and physical ailments to see whether or not people in Japan were reporting more problematic physical ailments, and we didn't seem to get that either. So to tell you a bit about the design of the study that we did, we asked people to wear sleep watches. So we asked people to wear sleep watches, and that watch measures when they sleep, estimates when they sleep, which is sort of like what it's basically sort of like what a Fitbit does now.
I was going to ask, these sleep watches that you're using in this study, is this the same that they're selling to the mainstream market, where it essentially just measures your movement to see if you're awake or not?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's basically it.
And is that good enough to know whether you're in a deep sleep or not? Because I've always wondered that. Like, I thought about getting the app once to see if it measures my sleep, but then I thought, how much I move doesn't necessarily mean that I'm in a deep sleep, or does it?
It's supposed to measure. So I'll say this: people's estimations of when they sleep is actually pretty. It matches up pretty well with when the sleep watches estimate that they are sleeping. And when people are in a deep sleep, they generally tend to not move. And so when there's a lot of the watch will measure what are referred to as awakenings. Okay. And so it will so people over the night will have a lot of these mini awakenings that they are not aware of oftentimes. And that's when you might have jerk movement, or you might have a small series of movements in your hand or in your arm. So that's what the actigraphy watch is picking up on. And generally it's a pretty decent measure of sleep, and it's been used by sleep researchers for a long time now. But what our actigraphy watch was also able to do was to send a beep every certain number of hours to ask them, how sleepy are you right now? And then they'll be asked to indicate on their sleep watch on a scale of 0 to 3, I can't remember exactly anymore, it's been a while, to indicate their level of sleepiness. And we find that for the Japanese participants, despite sleeping less, they weren't reporting being any less sleepy. In fact, sleepiness was higher among Canadian participants compared to Japanese participants. So they were sleeping less. They were expecting a weaker connection between sleep and health. They were idealizing a shorter amount of sleep, and they didn't seem to be. At least we weren't able to correlate the same kind of physical ailments associated with having less sleep, and we also weren't seeing any sort of a notable increase in self-rated sleepiness associated with them.
I think it's very important to note where you said you couldn't correlate the physical ailments, because that's what I jumped to right away. I was like, maybe they're just reporting this because in their culture it shows that you're tough, that you can handle no sleep, right? You're like, I'm not sleepy. But then, if you measure this with the ailments as well, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so we were measuring things like headaches. We were measuring things like coughing, dizziness, all these kinds of things. We were asking them, this past week that you were wearing this watch for, how much did you feel these different kind of symptoms? And we weren't getting a lot of traction, a lot of differences from those. I think what Dr. Heine is, so Dr. Heine is the sort of another faculty member that you spoke to before on this project, and I think what he has been thinking about is the idea that it's not so much yes, people objectively need a minimum amount of sleep. So perpetually going for 2 to 3 hours is probably not the healthiest thing for anyone, really. But beyond a certain amount, there's a certain level of cultural variability here, where people might be more affected by perceptions of their sleep based on their local ecology rather than some sort of universal expectations of sleep. What we mean by that is that people from different cultures will have different expectations about sleep. You need to sleep for 6 hours, you need to sleep for 9 hours, you need to sleep for 8 hours, etc. So we expected what Dr. Heine and the rest of our group was expecting was that it's not the total amount of hours that you sleep that's the problem. It is your amount of sleep relative to what your culture expects you to sleep. That is the bigger predictor of problems. And we have data right now from one study that seems to be panning out that kind of hypothesis. One of our students, who's been really doing a lot of great work doing the analysis for that research, recently presented this at our undergraduate conference in our department. And he was showing some data showing how it's cross-culturally we're not able to see that connection between health and sleep hours, but within the country they're able to see the connection between sleep and health. And so that I think shows the immense importance that culture has on even something as fundamentally biological as sleep.
It's fantastic. Now we're coming up on an hour here, so I think it's a pretty good place to end it. But I would just like to say on an anecdote, I can say that it's the same here in Spain. When I first came here about siesta culture, I noticed that everyone doesn't actually sleep during siesta. They usually watch TV, maybe read, or just lay in bed. And I was like, well, that's no good. No, I took sleep psychology. You need at least 45 minutes to get an additional 7 hours of recharge. Or you want to have a full cycle of an hour and a half to actually have the benefits of sleep. But it doesn't seem like that at all. And people really self-report that too. If they just have that hour just to lay back and relax, they feel fully recharged to then stay up till 12 at night and then wake up at 6, which is really common here.
And I think it really highlights oftentimes people assume that biological things exist outside the realm of social environments and culture, but that's not the case. If there's anything that I've learned from studying cultural psychology, it's how ingrained culture is in our biology, and how oftentimes we can't tease apart the two as easily as we might assume.
Definitely. Well, Ben, I think that's an excellent place to end the episode for today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure seeing you again, and I really appreciate it. Again, listeners, if you want to support the show, go to bornwithoutborders.substack.com. I just changed over my website because the community is a bit stronger there. Anyways, I hope you tune in next time. There's a new episode every Tuesday.